Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name is Renee LaValle McKenna, and I bring my 30-plus years as a recovering addict and ex-crazy person turned therapist and shamanic healer to bring you snackable teachings on spirituality, psychology, and all things personal growth. And today I want to share with you perhaps one of the most important conceptual models understanding the human experience that's been absolutely invaluable for me in finding hope, direction, and peace of mind in almost any circumstance in my life. And this is the idea of levels of consciousness. And there are a lot of different models and scales that are available. My favorite is from Dr. David R. Hawkins, and he created what he calls a map of consciousness. Fredrick Dodson has what he calls levels of energy, really similar scale to Hawkins. And there's the Abraham Hicks emotional scale, popularized by Esther Hicks, who channels the teachings of a group of spiritual entities known collectively as Abraham. And all of these scales point to the broader idea of the law of attraction, which suggests that our thoughts and emotions play a significant role in creating our reality. And what all of these models have in common is that they arrange our emotions in a hierarchy from the highest to the lowest vibrational frequencies, or the most pleasant to the most unpleasant human experiences. And the idea is that emotions with higher frequencies, such as joy and love, attract positive experiences, and lower frequency emotions, such as fear and shame, attract negative experiences. And what's really helpful about these models of emotional consciousness is that as we become aware of our current emotional states, we can learn to gradually move up these scales and improve our well-being, perhaps manifest our desires, and really change our life experience on the deepest levels. So at the higher end of the scale, joy, peace, and love. At the lowest end of the scale, shame, guilt, hopelessness, and depression. And the kind of mid-range is fear and anxiety, pride and judgment. And I'll post a link to the PDF I created, kind of merging some of these scales so that if you want to have a visual of what I'm talking about, you can look at it. I'm a visual learner, so I made it with lots of nice, pretty colors, and I actually refer to it all the time in my work with clients and in my work with myself. And so we have these lower emotional resonances, and there's nothing wrong with having difficult emotions. It's part of being a human and part of our processing system. And what these models offer is that we don't need to be stuck, ever. That we actually have the power through our attitudes, our practices, and shifting our perspectives actually allows us to move up and down these scales somewhat at will. So the truth is, if I don't like how I'm feeling, I actually have the power to change it. Now, it may not happen by Tuesday, but I personally believe that the earth plane that we're all playing around on here is a consciousness-generating machine, and that our work here is to evolve, expand, and grow. You know, we all have this compass of joy and pain. Joy, peace, happiness, connection, let us know we're going in the right direction. And pain, suffering, dis-ease, they're the guardrail to let us know something needs attention. And so the lower resonances, judgment, rage, anxiety, and depression, they cause us suffering, and they often cause suffering to others. They tend to be very self-centered. All of them actually rooted in fear in one way or another, and they all have aspects that are destructive rather than constructive to our spirit. And the higher resonances of trust, forgiveness, compassion, and love, these are positive, constructive experiences, more selfless perspective, and certainly more positive or pleasant emotional experiences within our own body. Now, we all move up and down these scales all the time. Again, there's nothing wrong with human emotions. They're part of a digestive process. But if we pay attention to ourselves, we may notice a couple of particular rungs on these ladders that we can get stuck on more than others. If you have a tendency towards shame or guilt, hopelessness or depression, anxiety or worry, or anger and resentment. And if you don't think you have any of those, you're likely stuck in pride, which refuses to look at itself and is very good at seeing what's wrong with everybody else, but doesn't have much humility or capacity to see deficits in the self. In the Roman Catholic system called the 7 deadly sins, pride heads the procession because it refuses to look at the self and blocks any growth whatsoever. So it's very interesting that the turning point between painful emotions and pleasant emotions, or negative feelings and positive feelings, is the resonance of courage. Courage moves us from a sense of victimhood or weakness into a state of empowerment. It shifts us from helplessness and apathy into self-responsibility. Courage gives us the willingness to face challenges and make decisions that promote our personal growth. That we're no longer trapped in fear and stagnation. Courage allows us to take proactive steps toward positive change. Courage is associated with positive action, cultivating the ability to face difficulties without being overwhelmed. And courage is often the starting point for true growth and self-development. So this really kind of radical perspective shift offered by courage moves us from seeing ourselves as victims into believing that we have the power to influence our life circumstances. So we all have our own unique worldview. It's like a pair of glasses that we see the world through. And all of our life experiences are filtered through these particular prescriptions that are unique to us. And these lenses include our early childhood experiences, how we were treated by caregivers, peers, include our traumas as well as our successes. And they're full of survival skills designed to keep us safe. And we don't even know we're wearing these glasses. Most of us are unconscious that we even have a worldview that might be changeable, that we could get a new prescription. And what these models do is allow us to update our lenses so we can start to see reality more clearly. And perhaps one of the simplest adages to demonstrate this is the idea of a glass of water on the table that's only filled halfway. And do we view the glass as half empty, or do we experience the glass as half full? And I would actually encourage you to play with this. I did a weekend workshop with Fredrick Dodson where over and over again, we intentionally took different perspectives of different situations to be able to experience the flexibility that we actually have to shift our emotional experience by shifting our perspective. And so if the glass is half empty, they might not be enough. The glass is being drained. There's a sense of loss. And if the glass is half full, be grateful. I know there's more to come. Acceptance of the abundance that's here right now. And it's very easy to tap into a consensus reality, and certainly with social media, news, technology, in this information age, we are inundated by other people's perspectives on reality, many of which actually have ulterior motives. Most of the news and media generating outlets are motivated by their own selfish financial gain. They don't have our highest good in mind. They are selfish rather than selfless, and intentionally or unintentionally prey and even cultivate the human emotional levels of anxiety and outrage as a way to get and keep our attention. Beauty of these models of emotional resonance tell us we have the agency and the power to be able to manage our own perspectives. We can choose where we resonate on these scales and be free of the often really disturbing lower resonances of a lot of, again, what I'll call consensus reality. So if you've ever sat in front of a television with a clicker, you get to choose what you watch. Do I want to watch a nature program, an inspirational speaker, a comedy, or a love story? Do I want to watch an action film or a horror movie or something about psychopaths and serial killers? And intaking information is food for our emotions, our energy, and our mind. What am I feeding myself? What am I feeding my consciousness? Am I feeding it fear and hopelessness? anger and pessimism? Or am I feeding myself peace and beauty, love and optimism? A really beautiful thing about these emotional scales is that they show us we don't need to jump from jealousy to appreciation or from blame to forgiveness. Those are kind of big jumps. Now, sometimes those jumps happen. Again, we all have access to our own consciousness clicker. But as we change the lenses intentionally and get new prescriptions, we only have to move up one rung on the ladder, and that is positive constructive change. Moving from shame to blame is actually an empowered improvement. Moving from hatred to judgment or pride is an elevation. Shifting from fear and anxiety into desire and craving is shifting our resonance up the scale toward the joy, peace, compassion, love, and connection that are our birthright. So I had an experience this week in a 12-step meeting, and there's a huge range of consciousness, particularly when you're in a city. And as I approached the meeting, there's a guy who lives on the street. He's a heroin addict. His girlfriend died in his arms a few years ago. Apparently, he's got some psychosis that's unmedicated, which I hadn't seen until this day. So he approached me and he said, "Do you have any money? I'm really hungry." He never did that before, but I actually really like Darren. Generally, he's very sweet and meek, even if he's completely unbathed, and often sits in the back and falls asleep because it's a warm place. So I handed him a 20. Honestly, I probably would have just handed him a 10, but all I had was a 20, and money is flow, so it felt like the right thing to do. And he said, "Oh, can I get you a coffee?" And I said, "Sure," because it's nice to be in exchange with people. And he said, "How do you take it?" I said, "Cream, no sugar." He said, "Half and half and one sugar?" I said, "No." "Decaf, cream, no sugar." So I wasn't very hopeful about the coffee, but that really wasn't the point. And about 15 minutes later, he came in, tapped me on the shoulder, and handed me a coffee and said, "You wanted half and half and 2 sugars, right?" "Sure." And then he left. He came back in. And he sat quietly for a little while. We did some reading. People were sharing. In this particular meeting, we sat in a big circle. And all of a sudden, he stood up and he pointed all the way across the room and he said, "You bastard! You aren't going to get away with that!" And he started raging at some poor innocent guy. "Yeah, you with the hat. You want to step outside?" Oh my goodness. So I had just had this very nice exchange with Darren. So I stood up and I said, "Darren, you're being really disruptive. You should step outside." And he continued to point and yell, but backed his way toward the door and went out. Now, my perspective, I have a lot of compassion for this guy. He's addicted. He's mentally ill. He's sleeping on the street, and he was obviously not taking any meds. Poor guy. So I'm in this perspective of compassion. I also feel really safe because he's not aiming his delusions at me. And the poor guy with the hat on is completely bright red and flustered. And by the time the meeting closed, he's ready to fight. I'm not afraid of him. Oh my goodness. So he's been really triggered into a place of rage and vengefulness. I had an older woman come up to me after and say, "That was amazing. How did you do that?" And so she's projecting some weird hero thing onto me, which I'm not interested in because Darren's kind of my friend. And the woman who was running the meeting texted me, thanked me for my help. She was in a place of gratitude. But there were some other people talking about feeling tremendously triggered, anxious, and unsafe. And yet another one of my friends spoke to me later and said, "Oh, I wish I stood up and supported you." And they were in a place of guilt. So every single person, and there was probably 35 people in the room, had a different perspective on what was happening. And then there's poor Darren, who I'm not going to say might not be a dangerous person, although I know that we can all be dangerous. And there's Darren's perspective of feeling like he was being threatened by some unseen, unknown force that exists in his own head. And I'm aware that we're all a little bit more like Darren than we would like to admit, that the demons in our minds often scare the shit out of us and they have nothing to do with what's actually happening right now. And so I encourage you to learn about your own levels of consciousness. Where do you get stuck? Can you experiment with different perspectives or even just observe that even consensus reality is a perspective? that perhaps there is no ultimate truth below the level of enlightenment. Thank you so much for listening. I have some monthly groups planned starting in January 2025. I'm going to do a monthly goals and visions group, each month focusing on a different aspect of our life, developing goals, visions, and action plans for positive change, physically, mentally, financially, romantically. I'm also going to start my first ongoing workshops, personal growth and transformation based on my book, Allies and Demons, teaching really practical transformational methods for working with spirit, for power and healing. And those are all going to be on my Patreon community. And you can just join for free if you want to see what's upcoming, or you can join paid, different levels depending on what you want to participate in. And there's a link to my Patreon in the show notes. Both the goals and vision groups and the working with spirit for power and healing groups are going to start again in January 2025. At this point, they'll be on Zoom. I hope you'll join me. I'm excited to have more personal, interactive connection. And I have a lot of really great tools to help foster and cultivate a healthy community of like-minded souls. Blessings on your path until we meet again. This is Renee LaValle McKenna for Spiritual Psychology.